Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and not with me today, as he normally is my lifelong friend and co-host Dylan. He is still on vacation, out and about doing his thing. So today I have brought in another very special guest host. This is a guest host that, OG Friends Talking Fantasy fans might remember way back, like in our first 10 episodes or 15 episodes or whatever it was, when we did our trip to New Zealand episodes. It was 3 episodes, and we also recorded the video for that. That was a whole production. So we all climbed Mount Doom together very many years ago. These are his credentials. We climbed Mount Doom together. We went, to the ford where Eowyn called the water to run over the ringwraiths. We went there. The ford of Brunin, I think it's called. We went to Rohan. We've seen it all, and we also have a good 25 plus years of friendship under our belt. This is the third member of the Friends Talking Fantasy OG friend crew, and of course, referring to Derek, our lifelong friend. Derek, thank you so much for coming on. And need I also mention that Derek and I have a podcast over on another channel called Roger Podcast, where we talk all things Star Wars. And that's enough about talking to him. Derek, welcome to the show.
What an intro. I mean, could you hype me up anymore?
I know. It's pretty awesome. On Monday, the episode with my mother will have aired. Now I've got you on. I'm going through all the people I know, and I'm running out of people now. So hopefully Dylan can come back next week so that I don't have to try and find more people. I know. It's like, dude, I only know 2 other people, and one of them's my mom. So it's like, what am I going to do after this? This is the end.
She reads a lot. She's definitely has some good recommendations. I know it.
Oh, yeah. The fans really liked it, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I think they're going to love this, too. As I said, it was the 3 of us and then my brother as well. I have a twin brother. So it was the 4 of us rolling around elementary school, high school, middle school, the whole thing. We, Dylan and I, our whole thing was that we're lifelong friends. But really, Derek was there the whole time, perhaps even longer. So you guys are in for a special treat. And if you haven't listened to those New Zealand trip ones where we did we toured New Zealand, but we also saw a lot of Lord of the Rings movie destinations along the way, you gotta go check those out. They're old, but it's a fun story. We got into a lot of shenanigans back in those days.
Yeah, I really liked coming on. This is my second time on, in case anybody... Well, I guess third if you count the double episode. Oh, it was
3 episodes.
Yeah, all right. So it's my 4th time on. So I'm glad to be back in the saddle with you.
Yeah,
on a different podcast.
That's right. We see enough of each other over on the Roger podcast, so it's no coincidence that we're talking about Star Wars today. As everyone could see from the title, we are discussing the question: is Star Wars fantasy? Now, we are on a fantasy literature podcast, so we're going to be trying to say yes to this question, but we're gonna talk it through. We're gonna have some fun talking Star Wars, and if you like what you hear with Derek and I talking Star Wars, and you want more of that, then go check out Roger Podcast. It's a lot of fun. We're watching Bad Batch right now, and we're also coming up with all kinds of other Star Wars shenanigans episodes along the way. We release 2 episodes a week, so you'll get your Bad Batch content, then you'll get your other Star Wars content. We're going to throw some other sci-fi stuff in the mix. So that's my sci-fi side. This is my fantasy side, and now we're kind of blurring them all together.
Yeah, and we even get some, Charles came up with who would win Star Wars edition over there.
Yeah.
We got some good things. If you're familiar with FTF, you'd probably like at least a little bit of Roger.
That's
But enough
true.
about that.
That's true. And
We
enough
got
of the plug. Let's get into what everyone's here to listen to today. Derek, is Star Wars fantasy?
I would say yes. Now,
Oh.
specifically, I would go with Star Wars is a fantasy plot in a sci-fi world. Because, a lot of people say, oh, Star Wars is a space opera. Star Wars is a Western in space.
Right.
Yeah, I see. You can really, depending on what your definition is, you could say anything is anything, really. But
Right.
but since we're on a fantasy show, I want to give, and I've thought this before I even wanted to talk about it on FTF, because here, I just thought of this the other day. It's kind of, I'm sure somebody else has made this comparison, but so we have a story. We have a chosen one. We have a rogue. We have a barbarian. We have a damsel in distress who turns out not to really be in that much distress. They go on an adventure.
We have a mentor.
Exactly. We have a mentor. We have a wizard.
Yeah.
These guys go on an adventure across the land to thwart the evil power, to thwart the evil king, emperor, what have you. They get into all sorts of different crazy situations. There's a little incest to bring it contemporary with Game of Thrones. And it's just the comparisons there. I think George Lucas was influenced quite a bit by older serials and older forms of media, and a lot of those were more fantasy than sci-fi. You know what I mean, Charles?
I know exactly what you mean. It's true. It's like you said, all the tropes are there, all the elements of the storytelling are there. And to me, that's a very important distinction. And I guess your answer to this question just boils down to how where you draw the line in terms of what's science fiction, because the setting is totally sci-fi. You have spaceships, lasers, outer space, planets, technology, but to me, it comes down to the story, it comes down to the characters, and it is told through this fantastical lens. There's so many elements to Star Wars that just invoke all of these things that I love about fantasy stories, more so than I love science fiction stories too, but for totally different reasons. And I think a lot of the reasons why I like Star Wars is a lot of the reasons why I like fantasy, this idea of this epic quest, this adventure. You have, we say something here on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, Derek. I don't know if you're familiar with hard magic versus soft magic at all. Okay, you are.
I was going to bring that up later, yeah.
Right, so we have a soft magic system here in the terms of the Force, which we have incredible world building that is up there with any high fantasy novel, right? You have different religions, you have these different powers, you have these different cultures and regions, which in this case are planets. You have all of the tropes that you had mentioned before as well. And to me, that is into the fantastical, and they're not trying to explain technology. I mean, there is some discussion of trade routes and things like that in politics in the prequels, but it's not really what those movies are about. It's just
the magic system gets a little harder as you go,
Right, with midichlorians and all that, we're going to say. It's true, but
but in reality, Star Wars, at least the original trilogy, is an old school chosen one fantasy quest.
Yes.
Thwart the evil empire.
Oh, yes.
It's literal swords and sorcery. They just happen to be laser swords. And the sorcery, I mean, I believe in episode 4, one of the Imperial officers makes fun of Darth Vader and calls him space sorcerer, something similar. I forgot what the actual quote is, but it even comes up. It's not by accident. The roots are really there. No.
Yeah, and even all the elements of the technology, right? Like what I love about a good sci-fi story is you'll have something like an android, and you get into how's the android made? Can the android think? Does it dream? Does it do all these things? Is it any different from a human being? These deep explorations into the technology and how it affects psychology or society, where in Star Wars, no one makes any effort to explain anything. it's,
No.
it's like no
In
one knows
fact,
how
they cover
lightsabers
things
burn.
up most of the
Oh,
time.
oh, absolutely. It's because don't ask them because they
Right.
don't know. And it's like they know more now than they did
Yeah.
back in the day, but they were just making the stuff up. So how does lightsabers work?
Doesn't
Don't ask
matter.
me. Light speed? Whoa, whoa, whoa. Death Star? Who's
Yeah.
asking? You know,
Who's Cypher Diaz?
Duh, who's Sifo Dyas? There's clone troopers now. You should be happy. Don't worry about Sifo Dyas.
100,000 more on the way is all you have to worry
exactly. So it's like, okay, we don't need to be explained as to like how all these technological aspects of the story work, because it ultimately doesn't really matter. It's the story of Anakin and how he and his family just progress in this universe, and it's about good versus evil, and it's about of
That's
hope
another
and
great
opposing a stronger force.
It is about good versus evil. It's quite most of the time, contemporary Star Wars has changed a little bit, but in general, especially original trilogy, prequels, other old school EU stuff, now Legends, black and white, this is good versus evil. There's some gray stuff later on where Legends picks up some of this, not the slack, but it depends what you think of it. And it's good versus evil. It's really old school classical fantasy. That's what it is.
What do you think when you go to the bookstore and they group sci-fi and fantasy together? Is that like, to you, does that... I'm not. That's all I'm gonna ask. Does that make sense to you? Is that something that you've you understand and all that?
I absolutely understand. If it's you're really trying to save space, it's not that big of a bookstore. Those go together so well because there is a crossover between a lot of. I would say the genres mesh very easily, and there's an overlap between what it actually is fantasy. Fantasy can be described as anything fantastical. It doesn't have to be swords and sorcery. It could be... there's a ton of other... Star Wars isn't the only example of this, but it's a less it's a less rigid sci-fi definition. And I think that goes hand in hand with fantasy. So I don't mind it. I'd prefer it to be a little separated if you have the room, but I don't mind it at all.
Right. For me, sometimes with science fiction, they get into this realm of like really getting into the nitty gritty of some kind of technology. I mean, fantasy can get down into the nitty gritty of all the like world building of all these fantastical things, but so I see them grouped together. The phrase speculative fiction is used quite a bit, and I like that as well. These ideas of just completely made up worlds and made up stories. Once you get to that point, there's not so much difference in whether technology or magic is involved. And in Star Wars, it just happens to be both.
Right. Well, I think if you get that vague, I think that's a little too vague for me personally if I was looking something up, because that can... You could throw historical fiction in there as well.
Yes.
That you're getting a little... It's too much under one umbrella if it's in a bookstore. Unless, your bookstore is the size of a coffee shop and you have like 3 bookshelves. So go for it, do what you got to do. But I think that's a little too vague. But sci-fi fantasy, and once you pick up the book, you're going to be able to tell which is which. But that brings me, if we're talking about genres, here's another good point.
Yes.
I'm going to say it's a good point because I'm saying it.
Yes.
It's a point, right?
I'm glad you think it's good if you're going to make it.
Okay, well, so I've read a lot of older science fiction as well, more than I have like high fantasy and old fantasy. Like I know you guys are reading Wheel of Time. That's above my pay grade.
Right.
But old school science fiction, and lesser into the present day, but it's still there. Science fiction really relates to what's happening at the time the book is published. You have things like anywhere from 2000 Leagues Under the Sea to District 9, which is a more contemporary movie. Science fiction kind of relates to what the world is feeling or what the country is thinking about or what's going on. You could see this in any Marvel and DC comics from the 60s through 80s, 50s, even earlier. All of that, like the atomic age, the fears of the public permeates into the medium, and that goes since Victorian science fiction. And this is not something Star Wars does at all.
Right.
So it's not classical sci-fi in that sense.
I'd say that that is actually a great point, and it's true that a lot
Wow,
of science
great.
fiction does kind of try to puzzle through certain elements of society or history or things like that, and it reminds me of like Arrival, which is a modern sci-fi movie that I love, which is about communicating with aliens, and
Right.
there's the use of the scientific method in that
Hmm.
movie. Like, that movie is so obviously science fiction because they're trying to communicate with aliens that don't speak English, right? And they're going back and forth and back and forth, and it's like, okay, well, this is the use of the scientific method and something completely made up to tell a compelling story that may
Right.
even be topical in some way in terms of like a sociological level. So it's like, okay, uh, that use of science, literally using science to tell a
Yeah.
story that involves aliens and technology, is very sci-fi for me. Star Wars does not use the scientific method at all. They aren't trying to do anything.
I don't
There
think they
was in the
developed it.
prequels, there was that little issue they had with like being being chased and they couldn't
Oh.
like hyperspeed out or pull back as a
Right.
fuel or something. But they who knows if they should have tried that or not. But they've embraced those things a little bit, but still,
They break their
what
own rules though. So
they break their own rules, and why people watch Star Wars is not for that. That's not what
right.
it's known for. So
And
what?
that's why
Yeah,
people get upset sometimes
yeah,
because hardcore sci-fi fans have a kind of a mindset of, this is space. Space works like this. What are you doing? It's because Star Wars does not work like a sci-fi. It
right.
works like a fantasy. And not
Yes,
like, you could have a contemporary fantasy where the rules make sense. It's a hard magic system and, gravity's exactly the same, but Star Wars it's fantasy in the literal word, not the genre. It's a fantasy. Anything can happen and,
right. Exactly. So, what the phrase that is used to describe Star Wars, and the creator George Lucas uses this phrase, is a space opera. So, to like that, the only time I've ever really heard space opera used, besides like there's a few other movies and stories, none of which come immediately to mind,
Hmm.
that aren't just like Star Wars ripoffs, are is this phrase space opera. Is that just saying fantasy in space?
Yeah, I mean, I believe most operas were exaggerated pieces of plays. I'm not an opera buff. I can't really tell you. But I think
Mhm.
it's kind of just, and I don't know if George Lucas really watched that much opera, but I think it's just a fancy way of saying it's a story. Enjoy the story. Stop thinking about the specifics. Especially, if I'm going to break it down a little in my head, an opera, it's, like a play. You kind of have to immerse yourself in it, let go of reality a little bit.
Right.
Forget that that's a set, you know? Forget that you see a guy in the background moving something and the curtain comes down and I mean literally the curtain comes down in half the shots. They
Yeah, I
have
mean the
the
transition
wipes, right.
swipes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's his way of saying, guys, you got to take this a little less seriously. He has some really good themes, a lot of really good I mean the plot is great in some of them, but it's not supposed to be taken seriously as iRobot,
Right.
something.
Yeah. The hard science is not going to get in the
Right.
way of the
He's
story.
tell he's telling a story, exactly. It's a
Yeah.
story.
It's
Enjoy
about
the
family.
story. It's going to be great.
It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. It's about family, and that's what makes. I see this phrase opera, and to me, it just means just like epic storytelling, the focus on story, and this idea of it being a longer
With a lot
format.
of pageantry too, though.
Yes, yes, and you have romance and these epics, huge themes like good versus
Hmm.
evil and hope and all of that,
Right.
and overcoming this great threat and all of these things, and so that's what I take from it. And I mean, that sounds a lot like fantasy to me, but
Right.
the fantasy, like, has there been a fantasy opera? I'm sure there has been, but it's certainly not a term that has taken off. So it's interesting. I feel
It only
like,
took off because he said it.
oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
space opera just works for Star
Oh yeah, it
Wars.
sounds great.
Right. It sounds awesome, and it puts the pressure off of all of the science having to like
Hmm.
work out. It makes people be like, "Hey, you like space and stuff, but like, what if that was the setting to tell this
Right.
epic, high-level story that
Hmm.
focuses on characters and reveals
Yeah,
and
and I think
drama?"
Yeah, and I think the fantasy genre fits it because people go with the western. They also, I hear people say that too, and I've
Hmm.
heard the argument for it. And yeah, like I said earlier, you can frame anything how you want if you use the right words and you give the right points, and you make the characters. Like I started out saying, "Hey, look, there's a bunch of D&D characters going on a mission."
Right.
Like or a quest, not a mission, but and so you can frame anything you want if you kind of word it the way you want. But I think there's enough more points that show the influences. I mean, the influences and how it's written and how the story develops and the key characters. It's more of a fantasy than anything else. It's a sci-fi
Right.
setting. That's
Right.
all.
And to me it's opera also is about the drama of like, okay, we're here for this like story. You have in the first 2 seconds you have the main character who is in this no name nobody, and all of a sudden his whole life was destroyed and he's whisked off into this like epic adventure, and
Right.
people die and people there's these reveals and there's these romances and all these things. You're like, oh man, it's the drama of it all that drives this story.
Hmm. And think of how many fantasy novels can you think of where it starts off similar? It starts off somebody's entire family dies and they end up having to go on a quest and they end up being the chosen one. Old school. It's less contemporary now because it's been done to death, but
Yes.
more in fantasy than in sci-fi. I'll tell you that.
Right, exactly. I mean, yeah, fantasy is just so full of tropes like those, and I mean, science fiction. Every genre has its tropes. It's what makes them the genre that they're in, and makes them so fun. And I think that's why Star Wars struck this really unique balance. It created flashy, cool tech in the terms of all these cool ships, and I mean, who doesn't love a lightsaber and the blaster fire and all of
Hmm.
these cool things? And then it keeps you going with the focus on the narrative and the story and the
Right.
characters and the drama. So it's like I think that's what just has made Star Wars so popular since the beginning is its unyielding creativity, its deep dive into the fantastic, but embracing these space themes that so clearly and were the inspiration for making these movies. It's like I want to make a space, a movie set in space, and the ambition of it and the production of it,
Right.
and like that magic that was captured by Star Wars that has caused it to be, all these years later, this huge cultural phenomena that is still coming out with stuff that everyone watches and kids love and all these other things. And I think it's that unique balance, the fact that you can't like pigeonhole it too directly. It only serves its to its benefit.
Yeah, and I think it made it more accessible too.
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
people see sci-fi, they think old school Star Trek, they think, especially at the time, they think, oh, Buck Rogers, they think Flash Gordon. It's not stuff that everybody wanted to, the nerds or the sci-fi nerds, that's what they did. This version of sci-fi, still sci-fi, but it has a whole story that really wasn't being told
right.
in that setting,
Got it. Where do you
especially
think?
cinematically.
Oh, for
Books are
sure, for
different,
sure.
but
And I mean, fantasy has the same things too. It's all right, like back in like the '60s or something. If you're making a fantasy movie, it was like okay, it's different than what we perceive fantasy. It's like okay, this was before Game of Thrones, where fantasy was like sexy
right.
and cool. It was like okay,
Yeah,
and
there's
before the Lord of the Rings
mhm.
movie, like you were making a fantasy movie, you run the risk of it being kind of lame because it's
There
like
are very few examples of solid fantasy movies before 2000.
yeah,
And
and
there
even
are
then, a
some.
lot of
There
them
are
are
some.
like
Partic-
technically fantasy, okay, like The
yeah.
Wizard of Oz or something like that. It's like, okay, yeah, that's a fantasy movie, but it's not like it's a swords and sorcery fantasy
Hmm.
movie. Nowadays, you get tons of awesome fantasy content, and
Right.
I just think it's stories like these. Where do you think something like this is going to throw you a curveball here? Something like all these superhero movies fits in all of this? Like, how does Star Wars, like, why is Anakin not a superhero, even though he totally is? I get it's like a really interesting kind of, it's like, okay, well, here's these characters that a lot of them have lots of cool tech, a la Batman or Iron Man or something like that. And we love to talk about, nanobots. Like, nanobots can do a lot of stuff for Tony Stark, and we don't really have to question it. But is it fantasy? It doesn't really feel that way. Like, to me anyway. I'm wondering, like, would you consider, like, all these Avengers movies, like, fantasy? And how it's, like, why is it not... To me, it's not as obviously fantasy as, like, a Star Wars movie is.
Right. I think my real answer is that they made their own genre. It developed superhero is now a genre. Yeah. Which I never thought would happen. It really is. Now, lower down, I would say, hey, you throw these in the sci-fi fantasy section.
Yes.
Now, these are cop-out answers, but that's
right.
where I
and
would
I guess
like
there's
them
also
to
these
go.
action elements, which, I mean, Star Wars has, and,
I was about to say, if I
full
was
of
going,
action.
if I was going to drop it down to you made me choose, they're action movies. You put them in the same thing. There's no reason John McClane.
Yeah, it's like John McClane, the politician.
Yeah, you didn't know he's an action star. No. He's a superhero. Yeah. He really is. What he got shot walking over glass. I mean, he's a person with superhuman abilities. Rambo. These are. I think that if you had to give them a real genre name, all of the superhero movies are mostly action movies.
Yeah.
But did you want me to pick a sci-fi or fantasy? Is that where you want?
Not necessarily. I just I was trying to think of like the spectrum, and
I think they're closer, a la Star Wars. They're closer to fantasy than real sci-fi.
I mean, some of them really get into like time travel and alternate universes and these different kinds of technological developments and things like that. But it's like you said, it's become its own genre. Really,
but it also really matters what your definition of the genres are. Because right now in this conversation, we've been pretty strict that sci-fi is kind of the movies that. They don't even have to be that futuristic. It could be movies that tell most of them are a futuristic look or a different look at problems in society or what's going on in the, world hive mind, if you will, and relate that into a thought-provoking story.
Right.
Or put a big part of that, even a small part, like in Alien, the corporation is basically the bad guy. Now, movies have been doing that for an age, but that's another example of, hey, we're getting to a point where we're seeing a lot of companies get a lot more power than they had, and that's a problem. They're ruining the environment, they're ruining other things, and that was a theme, that was a theme in Alien.
Right, and they also drew heavily from like horror influences, right?
Of course,
that's
like I mean, that's a horror movie.
It's a sci-fi horror film, yeah. So it's interesting, and I think it just comes down to like, look, what is even the point of trying to classify, categorize all of these things? It's interesting.
It's because it's in the title. We have to.
Spoken like a real host, not someone that's been through this a while.
No, I'm kidding.
It's like, we have a premise we have to talk about? Okay.
No, but I absolutely agree. All of these things are so arbitrary. As long as you have a description that makes sense and you could get a classification system that works, it's not too rigid, and you don't get too obsessed where these things land, and you don't really need to get into a debate whether... are they plot-based? Are they theme-based? Are they location-based? You can kind of tell what movie's what by just watching it.
Right.
That's all. I think it's more about feel than about definition.
I thought you were going to say it's about family there for a second. I was like, you're going to take Charles, that whole point you just weaved and undercut it with a joke?
I wish. If I thought of it, I would have.
No. The point you made was too good for that line, and I agree completely. It's like, look, these, like the blending of genres, especially in this modern age where there's so many creators trying to tell unique stories on the shoulders of these other classic works of fiction, it's kind of hard, and you have to try and subvert the tropes, and you have to pull in
Yeah.
influences from other genres, and it makes things harder to define, but it makes the stories so much better. And
Yeah.
Star Wars to me was one of these early moments in cinema, and it transfers over to modern age when you compare it to fantasy, which has now permeated cinema as well. And it's like, wow, they really were pulling from all these influences to tell this story. And, George Lucas goes on to say exactly, and like there's like samurai influences and German influences and
Right.
different kinds of religious
and old
influences.
school radio influences. He doesn't have any sci-fi influences at all. I mean,
Right.
that's not at all. There's some. I think Flash Gordon is one, but like that's again hardly a sci-fi.
Right.
There are, and again under the really strict definition, if you have to.
Mm-hmm.
But his influences were other things like samurai movies. Those are really amazing movies that have overarching themes and stuff. It's even less about the plot in some of them.
Yeah.
It's you could see where his influences were and what the story ended up being, and that's why he had more. And I'd say even some of those things have fantasy elements to them.
Yes, I agree completely, and that's what makes us one of the many, many reasons that we are huge Star Wars fans. We've seen a lot of the movies together, and Dylan was with us for some of them, and we've had long conversations about the characters and the plots and the stories, and
Yeah, we saw episode 8 together.
I
All three of us, right?
think so. Yeah, and then we
Chris was
saw
there, too.
Solo. You
Oh,
guys
yeah.
may have gone without me on that one.
Me, Dylan, and Chris. Yeah, it's possible.
But who knows? Between the four of us, we've seen a lot of movies together. So, it's just that we're a huge fan, and for many reasons, and it all comes down to look. It's a fun thing to watch. It's a great story. It's very compelling. It looks cool. It sounds cool. The characters are cool. The story's nice. It's like all these things that make it good. And is it fantasy? In part, yes. Is it sci-fi? Sure, yes. It's a science fiction setting, but hey, fantasy story.
You know what it really is?
Yeah.
It's Star Wars.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Wow.
There's quite literally nothing like it. It's its own. It's like the superhero movies. And you know what? It's becoming its own genre too. They're pumping out
yes,
content,
exactly.
man.
It's now its own TV genre for sure. It's you go onto Disney Plus. It's like, do you want the Marvel genre or do you want the Star Wars genre or do you want the Disney classic genre?
It's higher
like,
build than Disney stuff. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, well, it's like it's getting people talking, and it gets fans together like very few stories have. Even like Lord of the Rings story, like people love those, but they just it's not like a culture around the fandom like Star Wars has. It's gone meta.
around the fandom. I would disagree. I think the Lord of the Rings fandom has a pretty strong culture.
Oh, they do, but I mean, we have Star Wars conventions. I just think it's because Star Wars has the benefit of new content coming out all the time, and they're always doing all of these things. It's and we have all these new TV shows coming out, like The Bad Batch, that is currently going on, an ongoing thing that we have lots to say about, and and talk about like expanding your universe, expanding your world building, like telling auxiliary stories in your world is such a thing that I see in fantasy all the time, and it's something that Star Wars is succeeding in today. We have The Bad Batch, which is just not what you would consider the A-list characters from the Star Wars movies. It's, a subsect that we're witnessing scenes in Star Wars history that we all know, and we're getting the story through their perspective. And that is such like another point in the fantasy column for that, because it's like now we're getting these shows like, oh, we're getting a POV from Obi-Wan's point of view, we're getting a POV from Ahsoka's point of view. It's adds to the world building. There's an author that Dylan and I have been reading a lot, Joe Abercrombie, and he's doing the same thing. He's writing standalone stories that use the time within his trilogy that he's famous for to tell stories, and he brings certain characters in from those stories, and he brings in new characters to get new perspectives, and it's this part of world building and storytelling that a lot of genres use,
Right.
but to me it just pulls so far into the fantastical, and like, I don't know, it's just a good time to be a Star Wars fan and a good time to be a fantasy fan.
Yeah, well, especially if you like both, because bringing up the TV cinematic universe, I know that's not the right phraseology, but of Star Wars is again very different. I think all of the new stuff is still fantasy. The
Yes.
Mandalorian, it's not relating to current themes. It's not. It's really just Star Wars, and
Right.
everything that's going on. It's about family. It's about.
Right.
I mean, you have the Mandalorian, and I'm going to go with the child. Avoid spoilers.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have the Bad Batch, which is literally about family,
Yeah.
and I guess maybe it is about family, Charles.
It's always about family. It's what I'm telling you.
But all of this stuff, there are no real world themes. Sure, there's future tech. There's all this stuff, but it doesn't really feel like a sci-fi. It feels like an adventure,
Right.
and which is totally different than another serialized thing, Star Trek. Which
I was
feels,
going to bring up Star Trek.
Star Trek also, has cons. They have the Trekkies. They have a passionate fan base.
Spin-off TV shows.
But the thing is, most other than the most recent ones, most renditions of Star Trek are very heavy sci-fi.
Yes.
There's a lot of technical stuff. There's a lot of themes that were things that happened in real life came
There's
to be on the
ethical
show.
dilemmas as the result
Right.
of technology.
The
There's
first
the
interracial
scientific
TV
method.
kiss was on Star Trek because
Yes.
they wanted to prove a point. Like, all of this stuff happened for a reason. It's something sci-fi has been doing since at least the late Victorian era. I mean, the
Yes.
Time Machine is another good example
Yeah,
about the wonder and what people were feeling and thinking or worried about.
Exactly, and it's so interesting you brought up Star Trek, because I was going to do that at like the exact same
sorry.
point that you did. No, it's good because it means that we're on the same page here, because that's another like two fan bases, Star Wars and Star Trek. Like, I never got into a debate of like, oh, which is better, but it's kind of like
They're
as we were
different
growing
genres,
up.
man.
Yeah, as we were growing up, that was that thing of like, oh, Star Trek, Star Wars, like and the difference between them.
And that's why I think the fans fight so much.
Yeah.
It's because some are sci-fi fans and the others are fantasy fans. And then they're like, well, no, this is better because of these reasons. Okay, but those are fantasy reasons. Well, this is better because of these reasons. Well, those are sci-fi reasons. You know, you could like more than one thing.
Exactly.
Right?
I think that the modern fandoms have kind of come together. And it's interesting to see a show like Picard, which is the latest Star Trek thing, that I have not seen it. I don't have CBS All Access, but from my understanding, it's very drama focused and not so much from like the old Star Trek TV series that people are used to.
Right.
And
I got a point about. I got it.
Yeah.
Now we're going on tangents. It's like an episode of Roger Roger.
It's like an episode of FDF2, so we're all good.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You guys are a little better at keeping on track than I am, though. But okay, so the thing is, modern Star Trek is more like old Star Wars. It's hysterical. It's all about drama. There's relationships. The new Star Trek movies are action movies. They're not sci-fi movies.
Right.
They tried a little bit to work in some theming, but I mean, you have Spock beating up a guy on a train and screaming. Like, this is not, that's...
Yeah.
They're action movies in a sci-fi setting, and that's great. But it's funny that there was just this weird switch, because I don't know, man. It's just an interesting watching the timeline of Star Wars and Star Trek, and even some of the more like Game of Thrones. Just watching how these things develop and end up on a long-term scale is just fascinating to me.
Oh yeah, it's going to be really interesting, and we're going to get a Wheel of Time TV show at some point
There's
this
a new
year.
Dune coming out too.
There's a new Dune coming out, so it's like it'll be interesting to see how we can, because Wheel of Time is one of those ones that you could get scientific about the magic if you wanted to. And so it'll be interesting to see the approach that they take. But I have a feeling it's all going to be like Game of Thrones, but that's just me. I have not seen any previews or trailers or anything. This is just my personal bias, but that's okay. So yeah, it's just these stories are coming out at a rate faster than ever before, and we're able to watch them and all these different places and read them, and it's interesting to see. But the one thing that has remained constant is Star Wars, and maybe we'll come full circle where Star Wars has one of these spin-off TV shows that just like heavy science fiction a la Star Trek, and then we'll know we've come back around.
I would love that, Charles. I would love that. I think we copy FTF all the time. We do pitching shows and stuff.
Yeah.
One of my pitches was, I think, a Star Wars themed show, but really hardcore sci-fi. Like there's actual. Basically, it's like we worked it into Star Wars Visions, where it could be just a standalone story of the week. It doesn't have to be an overarching, dramatic story. Sometimes you just want to watch an episode that has nothing to do with the other ones.
That's right. And and that's the beauty of telling stories in these vast, ever-expanding worlds, is you can create different kinds of stories that draw from different influences, whether it's horror, science fiction, comedy. It's like we can get it all. And
mixing the genres is some of the best stuff.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I love
taking
horror,
tropes we're familiar with and developing them into new places. And Star Wars has been doing that for a long time. Yeah. And all of our favorite sci-fi and fantasy stories do that too. And it's just makes a good story. And we talk to a lot of fantasy fans on the show through social media at the FTF Podcast 1 and all of that. And there's a generous amount of overlap with Star Wars fans. Just think like people in the world know and like Star Wars.
There's a good chance they like Star Wars.
Yeah. It's like, do you exist? Do you do you live in America and have like an access to TV, and like do you keep up with popular culture in the past 60 years? You
probably have a positive influence of Star Wars.
Exactly. So it's like we do get a lot of Star Wars fans, and it makes sense to me. I don't know. Like we do open ourselves up to more sci-fi. We have read a few science fiction books for the show, and they're always great. And it's like you said, it's sci-fi fantasy. The line is so blurred. Yeah. It's so thin.
Extremely.
Yeah, and
then even throw in subgenres into that. It's all defining everything. We don't have to, look at Blockbuster anymore.
Right.
You don't need to find your movie in a spot and it's something you've never heard of. If you're on Netflix, HBO, you're on demand on your TV, you're looking for a movie anywhere on the computer. You can easily read a description, and you can suggestions for you. It doesn't matter what genre it is. If you're going to like it, you're going to like it. And that's the important thing. Exactly.
And we asked the question today, is Star Wars fantasy more to use as a vehicle of being like
discussion,
why all these awesome fantasy influences exist in Star Wars, and why we like Star Wars so much, and why you may like the Roger podcast, why that connection
what a plug
might be made for you. Because guys, this kind of high level derailed banter can only occur on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast and on Roger podcast. We're keeping the Friend Network alive through this little early stages of a podcast network. It's a lot of fun, and it's just from a love of stories, and Star Wars just happens to be the umbrella that we put under our conversations for stories. But we love to talk about science fiction too. We keep saying that, and at some point we are going to do something.
But we keep thinking of other things to do, and it pushes it back.
Yeah, I know. So there's no shortage of ideas for us right now. We're in the very early stages of the show. We've done 19 episodes? 19 episodes. So we're still in the very early stages.
It's about where I came on last time, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
That's crazy.
That's around the number when you came on for FTF. So you can imagine how in its infancy, FTF was.
Yeah.
So there's so much that's going to change and happen. We talked about maybe watching Blade Runner, which gets
Harrison Ford connection.
Harrison Ford connection. That's right, a sci-fi connection, kind of.
I want to watch Aliens. I know you've never seen it, right?
I've seen Alien. I haven't seen
Aliens.
Aliens.
Plural.
I've only seen Alien.
It's the same movie, just a different place.
And
it's really good though.
I'm fine with that, dude. I love Alien. I don't know why I haven't seen the others. That doesn't make any sense.
You're good with 2 if you really.
I know what happens. Like I know like the scenes that get referenced, like when Sigourney Weaver's in like the mech bot and stuff like that. Which we don't want to get into what happens, but
Well, if you haven't seen. Well, I guess some people haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. Yeah, so let's.
Well, if you haven't seen it, you already know the spoilers. It's like somebody's father.
And it's like and it's like and it's not even like the point of that movie anyway. The point is like it's a very like the ambiance of the movie is really interesting, and do you want to be scared, and there's some kind of body horror stuff and things like that too, which I am a fan of. I'm always down for that. And so we're gonna try and bring more of those. And Blade Runner,
Original Dune, I think also has an umbrella that I think is another one that could be multiple categories.
Yes, we should definitely do Dune. I know that new movie comes out in October, so we should definitely be planning for that. And then so we've got, maybe we'll read some books, who knows, maybe we'll bring Dylan on at some point in time.
I definitely, there's a lot of good sci-fi books, man. I definitely do that.
And
even a short, I know your reading schedule is nuts. So I even have one of my favorites, I don't know if anybody else has read this, is H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. It's super short. Here's my literature plug right now.
Okay.
It's super short. I love this. It's like a little novella. You could read it in like a day if you really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's great.
I've never read it.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite books. It's not even a book, but I really like the story there. It's very clever.
Cool.
And just so you guys know, if you're listening this long, I don't just like sci-fi stuff. As Charles said, we went to New Zealand just to go through the Lord of the Rings.
Doom, people.
Really. And I have literally, Charles is looking. I have a poster of Middle Earth behind me, framed.
Yeah, that we got in Wellington
Studios.
and Weta Studios.
Right. And my point is, so I just read the foreword to the second edition of Lord of the Rings. Right. And on a plane, and I wanted to just mention this popped into my head.
Okay.
It's a really funny Tolkien excerpt. Which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But so if anybody's listening this long,
this is a deep cut, guys.
Yeah, it's just pretty funny. It's here we go. Some who have read the book, or at any rate reviewed it, have found it absurd, contemptuous, and I have no cause to complain because I have similar opinions of their works. I thought he was just being pretty nasty, but I mean it's fair.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of endearing. I mean, when you're innovating, in this case that Tolkien was, it's like, it's so easy at the time to be like, what is this nonsense, dude? He makes no sense. He's making these things up, but it's just creative storytelling. And when you come from a place, and I mean, does it get any more epic in themes than, you have Lord of the Rings, good versus evil, hope, all of these things, like humble beginnings going up against this all-powerful threat. It's all these things that we've known and loved about Star Wars, that we love about Lord of the Rings. That's all I was going to say.
And to bring it back onto like the genre a little bit, so later in this forward, Tolkien talks about how a lot of people, there's a difference between an analogy and what classical sci-fi does in genre about talking about people. The point is, people were considering for a lot of years that Tolkien was using World War I and II as analogies in his book, in all the books really. And he says, of course, parts of my personal experience, any author, it's going to permeate into whatever their medium is, writing, painting, anything. But it's not, has nothing to do with that. This story was planned from the beginning, and his experiences seeped into it, but nothing's like an allegory for a war a
Right.
real war.
Mhm.
And that I thought that was interesting. And not that, of course, this is not a staple that could run across every author and every um,
In every
work of
story.
fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, story, fantasy story
Hmm.
specifically. But it's just interesting that here is an example of kind of something what I'm saying, that this has nothing to do with real life.
Yeah, you have the author
Yeah,
purposefully saying like, "Hey, like this is not an allegory for a war or anything like
right.
that. This is a fun story that
Which I
I've
didn't know.
created." Yeah,
I
I mean a
didn't
lot
know.
like I can see the influence of Tolkien's service in World War One in the story.
Absolutely.
But do I
I
think
almost,
it's
yeah.
about World War One? Like not necessarily.
Yeah,
And
well, I thought it might. I never thought it was about World War I or World War II, but I
right.
thought there was I thought it was more influential than it was. And after reading this, it not at all. It was a big viewpoint changer for me,
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I always got these themes of like brotherly love and camaraderie, things
which
that,
is huge in a lot of World War I novels.
yeah, exactly, and it's something that it seems to me like he very obviously experienced because his relationship between Frodo and Sam do that so
Right.
well, and it's something that only someone that could have had real life experience have written something like that. But that doesn't mean that we have to make a political statement or a socio-economical statement or anything
Hmm.
like that. He's he's trying to create a brand new world and
Right.
put you in it and tell a story in it. And that to me is what Star Wars does as well.
Yeah.
It's, hey,
Right.
George Lucas had a very specific vision of I want to take people into a totally new environment, create this new world, and tell an opera in it,
Hmm.
tell a drama in it, and entertain people. And that's the
Yeah.
that's the
And
connection.
another good parallel, which hey, this is a good thing we went on a tangent, guys. Is that so? Tolkien had his idea not after. It took a while after The Hobbit to come up with the whole idea, but he had it from, I guess, the starting of writing Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
But I know he retconned a couple of things from The Hobbit, so he didn't have everything planned, but it was in his head.
Mhm.
But so George Lucas, similar. He knew about he could picture the fight between Obi-Wan and Anakin during the scene where Obi-Wan is talking to Luke about the Clone Wars and
Ah.
mentioning his dad. He knew that
Mhm.
already. So this is just another, an example of an author or a creator having this vision, this fantastical vision of
Yeah.
their head, and taking years and years to build it and bring it to life.
Yeah.
And just not, this has nothing to do really with proving my point that Star Wars is a fantasy. I just thought it was a really interesting parallel that I didn't consider until right now.
Yeah,
It's
this
kind of a
idea
weird
of like,
coincidence.
yeah, when you telling an expanded world, you are trying to build history into it, and there's so much history in something like Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
George
Another
Martin
one,
has
years. Yeah.
published volumes of stuff about the history of the Targaryen family and all these other things, and then you could read all of these extended notes and journals that have been bound and published from Tolkien, and it's
Yeah.
like, wow, these guys were doing all of this, and Lucas was playing the long game with his stories. He had ambitions to tell all kinds of stories, and fortunately, the first couple movies took off and he was able to tell a
Hmm.
lot of them, and now it's in the hands of new creators telling new stories. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear that kind of that storytelling influence pulled in, and just the
Yeah.
way fantasy stories are told and prepared, the
I'm
meta
sure
way
there's
in which these
contradictions
authors.
to that too.
Oh yeah.
In any genre, really. I'm sure. Like I said, we're not trying to use this to prove a point, but it is something that I
No.
think is integral to coming up with a kind of an epic tale, really.
Yeah, I mean, if you are a hardcore fantasy fan, love Brandon Sanderson, Robert Jordan, all of Tolkien, and you're like, yo, keep that Star Wars stuff out of the genre, that's totally fair and fine. Like, I agree with you in many ways.
I think you're trying too hard. I think if you gave it a chance, you'd probably like it.
Yeah, give it a chance.
Maybe some of them
Check
are
out a
kind
few
of,
episodes of Roger Roger. Maybe try out the Bad Batch, and then watch our follow-up discussions on the episodes. Those kinds of things. But I also get it. I get it. It is space and lasers and space travel and technology and all robots. All that stuff
People
is
can
there.
Teleport.
Aliens, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Aliens, what? There's mythical beasts. And
there's mythical beasts,
other
gods,
races.
deities, all these other,
right. Mermen.
Right. But the one thing we can all agree on is we love a good story, and that's what these stories have done for us. Star Wars, guys, if you are a fan of Star Wars, check out.
Or you just like me more than Dylan.
Or you liked the banter that you heard today, and you're like, you know what? Like, let's get this guy on the show and forget whoever it was that has been doing this the past 130-something times. Check out Roger Roger. That's what it's for. It's what it's for, guys. So go over and listen to that. You won't be disappointed. And, otherwise, Derek, thank you so much for being on the show. Are there any parting words you'd like to express?
I'm just really happy to be back. I love being on the show.
Oh,
and you guys have made me read more than I have in a while. So that's
awesome.
I mean more fantasy specifically than in a while. Yeah.
That's awesome to hear, man. Yeah, no, we've really enjoyed talking fantasy and getting out reading. Like, I've read more books in the past year than I've had in a long time.
Probably ever, right?
Yeah, probably. I mean, a book every 2 weeks is a lot for me, and that's kind of the pace that we're working at these days. So, yeah, I mean, the year prior to starting Roger Roger, I don't think I was reading a book a month. So, yeah. It's been a big change, but I've been really enjoying it, and I've been really enjoying chatting with you today. Like I've said, we all grew up together, so we're all in the same crew, and I'm glad that we're able to work together, and doors always open. I'm sure Dylan's sad that he missed out on our hangout record sesh right now, but he's the one that chose to be out on vacation, so his loss.
Well, I'd be happy to come on any other time, or we could try to get Dylan on.
Dylan has to come on Roger Roger, man. That's the thing.
See, the thing is, hopefully listening to this, he's not even going to listen to this episode.
I think he will, just to make sure we don't smack talk him too much.
But maybe he'll find. We got to find something more Star Wars related that he would like, because I understand not liking the prequels too much. The original trilogy, if you're not super into it, I get it. But we want to discuss something that he's passionate about Star Wars. So if you guys have any ideas, tweet him.
Yeah, Dylan is a Star Wars fan. He's just not as passionate as us. So coming up with like a fun conversation.
He saw all the movies.
He's seen all the movies. We've had long conversations. He has opinions. So we will find a way.
But we want to find something that he loves more than the other stuff, so we can talk about it on Roger Roger.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think we might pull on some of his psychology influences.
How could we not?
And get some of his opinions there. But that's just something you guys will just have to wait on, because that is so far. We can't even get him to show up to our own podcast, let alone get him to show up to another one. So we're gonna go ahead and get that schedule out and make something happen, because we all gotta be in this together now. So it's all about family in the end, after all, and you guys are like my brothers. So super happy to be talking. Awesome. Derek, again, guys, host of the Roger Roger podcast, along with me.
Co-host, don't sell yourself short, Charles.
Well, I said along with me, I'm a host as well. You're also a host, and it's a lot of fun, so don't miss out on it. Thank you all so much for putting up with all of this banter. Yeah. And
nobody's listening. It's been an hour.
I know.
But if anybody's there and you disagree with my Star Wars is a fantasy more than sci-fi, or if you have any other good points that I missed, and I'm sure I missed a lot because we're kind of just free-forming this discussion.
Right.
hit me up on Roger Pod at Twitter and Instagram. Probably
That's
Twitter
right,
would be best
guys.
for that.
Roger Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Check it
Yeah.
out.
We'd
And
like to talk about this stuff. It'd
oh,
be
dude,
cool.
yeah, we would. We're very active on social media, and then Dylan and I are out there as well on our personals and on the FTF accounts. So there's all kinds of shenanigans going down all the time. So be sure to check that out. And yeah, Derek's voice on Roger Pod is awesome. So any Star Wars fan would be down. Like, I just saw your episode announcement for our latest Bad Batch discussion, and I approve. So awesome stuff. And I think that's enough. I think we just got to end this, or we're going to be up all night at this rate.
Yeah, that's true. We're recording late.
Yeah, we are recording very late, so I'm going to go ahead. If you couldn't tell already, but we are recording late, so I'm just going to go ahead and play the outro music now.
Let's hear it.
We go.
I've been waiting for it.
Well, here it is. Thank you all so much for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, check us out over on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end, or on Instagram at the FTF Podcast. And also, guys, if you like what you heard today, check out Derek and I's relatively new show called Roger, a Star Wars podcast over at Roger Pod on Twitter and Instagram. If you have some extra time and you just so happen to be listening on an Apple device, rate both of those shows 5 stars, and then maybe scroll down and write a nice little review as well. Anything you guys can do would be greatly appreciated. But just listening, guys. Just listening, more than enough. Thank you all so much for your support. We greatly appreciate it. Derek, thank you again for coming on the show and helping us out and being our co-host for today.
What a professional this guy is. Holy cow.
I mean, when you've done it enough times.
I'm happy to help, Charles. Anytime you need a hand, let me know.
Oh, that means so much. Thank you, friend. And then, as always, go forth and conquer, friends.